Welcome, dear listener, to a tranquil journey through the winding corridors of the past. As you settle into your bed, feel the softness of your pillow beneath your head and allow your breathing to slow. In this gentle hush, we will travel back to a time when crowns gleamed by candlelight and great castles rose above misty valleys. A time when the lives of kings and queens shimmered with both splendor and sorrow. Imagine, if you will, the dawn gliding across the cold stone of a royal chamber. The air is perfumed with the mingling scents of beeswax candles and freshly cut rushes. High above, a carved canopy shelters the sleeping monarch. The hush is broken only by the measured footfall of a servant entering to light the hearth. For medieval royalty, the day began not with leisure, but with rituals that balanced luxury and obligation. In those hushed mornings, kings and queens would rise to prayers in their private chapels. Dressed in soft linen or embroidered velvet, they knelt on cold flagstones, their voices joining a chorus of Latin supplication. To rule was to be more than a sovereign. It was to serve as a living embodiment of God's favor. And so, piety wove through every hour. Once prayers were complete, the business of the day commenced. Imagine the royal couple seated side by side as petitioners filed into the audience chamber. Some came seeking justice. Others arrived bearing gifts or grievances. A medieval monarch's life was a ceaseless negotiation of duty and privilege. Every decision shaped not only the fate of the kingdom, but the intricate balance of power among nobles, clergy, and foreign allies. Beyond the solemnities of governance, the castle thrummed with quieter rhythms. In the queen's apartments, maids tended to tapestries and polished silver basins. Courtiers whispered gossip of alliances and scandal. The king might steal a moment of respite by the fire, a goblet of spiced wine in hand, while the steward recited the day's expenses in a droning voice. Even at the pinnacle of society, there were moments of weariness, of longing, of the ordinary peeking through the pageantry. And yet, the life of royalty held its own peculiar consolations. Feasts in the great hall were spectacles of abundance and artistry. Tables sagged beneath platters of roasted game, spiced stews, and candied fruits. Musicians strummed lutes, while jugglers tossed gleaming orbs. These banquets were not merely indulgences, but statements of power and wealth, a reminder to every guest that here sat the undisputed heart of the realm. As you listen, perhaps you can imagine yourself among the guests, warmed by the fire and the heady scents of rosemary and cloves. But even as laughter rippled through the hall, shadows always lingered. Political rivalries could ignite into open conflict. A king's favor could vanish as swiftly as a candle snuffed by a draft. In the medieval world, no position, no matter how exalted, was ever entirely secure. Such tensions shaped the lives of remarkable figures, none more vivid than Eleanor of Aquitaine. Born into a domain of vast wealth and culture, she would become first the Queen of France, then of England. Picture her as a young bride, traveling from the warm courts of Aquitaine to the austere halls of Paris. Her marriage to King Louis VII was solemn and strategic, a union designed to bind territories together. But Eleanor was no passive consort. She possessed a quick mind and a spirit that chafed under constraint. When Louis embarked on the Second Crusade, Eleanor insisted on joining him, riding at the head of her retinue in gleaming armor. Whispers soon followed, rumors of disagreements, of scandal, of a queen too willful for her husband's liking. After years of discord, the marriage was annulled on the grounds of consanguinity, a convenient pretext to end a partnership grown cold. Eleanor returned to Aquitaine, her wealth and independence intact. Within weeks, she married Henry Plantagenet, the future King of England. Their union would create an empire that stretched from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees, a realm as dazzling as it was fractious. Imagine their early years together, young, ambitious, full of plans. They welcomed children, presided over courts filled with troubadours and knights, and expanded their influence on both sides of the Channel. But as the decades passed, ambition curdled into resentment. Henry's wandering affections and Eleanor's fierce independence set them on a collision course. When their sons rebelled against their father, Eleanor supported them, seeking to carve out power of her own. For this act, Henry imprisoned her. 16 long years spent in confinement, her spirit undiminished even in isolation. As you rest, perhaps you sense the flicker of torchlight against cold stone walls, the quiet defiance of a queen waiting for the day she would rise again. And she did. Upon Henry's death, her son, Richard the Lionheart, freed her and restored her to a place of honor. In her 70s, Eleanor continued to travel, to negotiate treaties, to shape the fate of kingdoms. Even in the twilight of her life, she remained a force few dared underestimate. Eleanor's story is not just a chronicle of intrigue and ambition. It is also a reminder that medieval queens were both symbols and individuals, expected to embody virtue and piety while navigating a world that rarely granted them genuine autonomy. Like all monarchs, they balanced duty with longing, power with vulnerability. So, as you drift further into this reverie, know that the tale of Eleanor is only one thread in the vast tapestry of medieval royalty. In the chapters ahead, we will explore more of these stories, of piety and pageantry, triumph and loss. Let your imagination wander freely as the hush of the castle deepens and the centuries slip quietly away. Imagine now, dear listener, the corridors of the royal palace still hushed by dawn. The air is cool, scented with fading embers and the faintest trace of rosewater. The king sits alone, his face lined with the cares of rule, while the queen's chamber is slowly brightening. Here, a gentle ritual unfolds, ladies in waiting drawing back the heavy curtains, brushing out the queen's hair until it gleams like fine spun gold. A hush of reverence fills the room. Even in these private hours, the performance of monarchy never truly ceased. Throughout the day, royal children, sometimes as many as a dozen, were tended by tutors and nurses in chambers of their own. Childhood in medieval castles was a peculiar mixture of privilege and loneliness. Young princes were taught Latin, law, and the art of war, while princesses learned to dance, embroider, and recite the delicate verses of courtly love. From an early age, they knew their destinies were not their own. A daughter might be promised to a foreign ruler, While she was still in her cradle, her life's purpose narrowed to a single glittering alliance. A son, meanwhile, was expected to embody every ideal, to be fierce yet merciful, pious yet politically astute. The weight of legacy pressed upon their small shoulders long before they could grasp the meaning of duty. And always, the cycle of feasts and ceremonies churned on. Imagine the banqueting hall lit by hundreds of beeswax candles, the walls hung with tapestries depicting lions, battles, or saints in radiant colors. Guests sat at long tables laden with trenchers of bread, silver dishes piled high with roasted swans, peacocks in their plumes, and honeyed fruits. The king would preside from a raised dais, cup in hand, while minstrels plucked soft melodies that drifted like a lullaby among the rafters. Each course announced the splendor of the realm. Each toast, each flourish of music, was a careful display of the monarch's prosperity and the divine favor that was believed to uphold it. Yet beneath this pageantry, a more complicated reality pulsed. Power was never absolute. Alliances with powerful nobles were fragile. A single misstep, an ill-chosen marriage, an unpopular decree, could set entire regions ablaze with rebellion. A royal life balanced always on the edge of uncertainty. Consider Empress Matilda, daughter of Henry V of England. Groomed from childhood to be the first woman to wear England's crown, she learned early how quickly fortune could turn. When her brother drowned in the White Ship disaster, she became her father's sole heir. But upon his death, her cousin Stephen seized the throne, plunging England into decades of chaos, known as the Anarchy. Picture her, determined and unbowed, rallying forces, laying siege to castles, escaping from a snowbound fortress under cover of night. For a moment, she came tantalizingly close to her coronation, only to be driven out of London by a populace unwilling to accept a woman as sovereign. In the end, she never wore the crown she fought for, though her son, Henry II, would one day inherit it, ushering in a new dynasty. The story of Matilda reminds us that royal power was no shield against disappointment. Even when the bloodline was impeccable, even when the claim was undeniable, the whims of lords and the gossip of common folk could topple a queen before she ever sat upon her throne. And what of the queens who were not warriors? Many embraced a quieter path of influence. They became patrons of abbeys and churches, sponsors of poets and musicians, protectors of the poor. In the cloisters they founded, they found a measure of solace, a retreat from the intrigues of court life. But no matter how pious or gentle, a queen's primary duty was to bear children, especially sons. The pressure to produce heirs was unrelenting. Imagine, if you will, the hush that fell over the court when a queen's pregnancy was announced. The cautious hope that this child might secure the dynasty. The long months of vigil. And then the bright ringing of bells when a healthy prince arrived, or the muted sorrow if he did not. Consider Queen Philippa of Hainault, the beloved wife of Edward III. She bore 12 children, many of whom survived to adulthood, an achievement almost miraculous in that age. Throughout her life, she served as regent in Edward's absence, raised her brood to rule, and quietly embodied the virtues her people cherished: kindness, loyalty, and grace. Yet even she could not escape the rigors of her duty. After years of childbirth, her health waned. She died not long after delivering her last child, leaving Edward desolate. In a rare moment of vulnerability, he sat beside her bed, holding her hand until the end. For all the grandeur of their marriage, the tapestries, the jewels, the processions, it was this simple scene of love and loss that endured in memory. So it was that royalty, for all its trappings, remained a life both luminous and shadowed. As you listen, perhaps you sense that duality, a gilded existence always underlaid by sacrifice. For every triumph, a cost; for every celebration, a burden carried in silence. In time, the rhythms of the royal household settled into a predictable pattern. Mornings of devotion and duty, afternoons of councils and audiences, evenings of banquets, music and dance, nights of whispered counsel in the privacy of richly curtained chambers. Yet the most powerful monarchs still slipped into sleep with the same secret worries. Would their children survive to adulthood? Would their reigns be remembered with honor? Would the kingdom hold together when their bones lay beneath cold stone? As the candles guttered and the last murmurs of servants faded, a hush fell over the castle that felt almost sacred. In that hush, kings and queens might finally exhale, their masks set aside, their hearts briefly unguarded. And so, dear listener, as your own eyelids grow heavy, you too can let your cares drift away. Imagine yourself in a quiet turret room, the moonlight silvering the tapestries, the hush of centuries gathering softly around you. For in this place, you are neither commoner nor crowned head, only a soul at peace, resting in the tender embrace of time's unbroken story. Beyond the flickering glow of hearths and the solemn hush of chapels, life in the medieval court unfolded like an endless pageant. Each day brought the same blend of ceremonial splendor and quiet burdens. Courtiers rose before dawn, moving softly through the labyrinth of chambers to prepare for the monarch's awakening. Candles were lit in long rows, fresh rushes scattered over cold floors, and the air warmed with the scent of lavender and wax. While kings and queens donned their layers of embroidered finery, the castle itself seemed to stir to life. In the kitchens, cooks set about their work in cavernous rooms lined with hooks and spits. Great slabs of meat roasted over open fires. Pastries were filled with spiced fruits or sweetened almonds. Every detail of the royal diet was carefully planned, not only to nourish, but to proclaim status. At the high table, no dish was too elaborate, no presentation too extravagant. And so, the days passed in a measured rhythm of devotions, councils, and feasts. But beyond the predictable rituals, there were moments of quiet humanity. A queen pausing to soothe a fretful child. A king's hand brushing against his wife's as they passed in a corridor. Small, fleeting gestures that reminded all who witnessed them that behind the crowns were simply men and women, trying, like anyone, to love and be loved. Consider again Eleanor of Aquitaine in her later years. Freed at last from her long captivity, she returned to court with her formidable spirit intact. Though nearly 70, she rode for days across her domains, negotiating treaties and arranging marriages to strengthen her son's rule. She had endured betrayal, imprisonment, and heartbreak, yet her determination never waned. She was, to her contemporaries, almost larger than life, a queen whose resilience inspired admiration and fear in equal measure. Her story stands as proof that royal life could be both a prison and a proving ground. Eleanor was celebrated for her learning and her taste, her wit and her will. But she was also judged, sometimes harshly, for stepping beyond the boundaries set for women. In her court at Poitiers, she cultivated an atmosphere of refinement, patronizing troubadours who composed verses extolling the virtues of love and chivalry. These songs would travel across Europe, shaping the very language of romance. Yet even in her twilight years, Eleanor's influence was never simply ornamental. When her son Richard the Lionheart was captured on crusade, she organized the massive ransom to secure his release. When he died, she supported her youngest son John's claim to the throne. And when at last she retired to Fontevraud Abbey, she did so with the knowledge that she had left her mark upon kingdoms and hearts alike. But not every queen wielded such power. Many found their roles circumscribed by expectation, symbols of virtue and fertility rather than political actors. Their worth measured by the number of sons they produced and the gentleness of their demeanor. Take Queen Isabella of France, known in later chronicles as the she-wolf. Married to the weak-willed Edward II of England, Isabella grew resentful of her husband's favorites, men whose influence eclipsed her own. When the moment came, she broke all convention, fleeing to France, taking a lover, and returning at the head of an invading army. The scandal was immense, yet even as her power peaked, it was precarious. Within a few years, Isabella's son, Edward III, seized control, executing her lover and confining her to genteel seclusion. Her tale reminds us that even the boldest royal women walked a narrow ledge between admiration and condemnation. A queen who overstepped could be cast as a villain as easily as a heroine. The line between respect and ruin was thin indeed. And what of the kings themselves? They too were bound by rigid expectations. A king must be a warrior, courageous in battle, merciless to his enemies. He must be a pious shepherd to his people, upholding the church and dispensing justice. He must be a patron of the arts, a master of diplomacy, a model of chivalry. It was an impossible ideal to embody. Consider Edward III of England. Crowned as a teenager after his father's humiliating fall from power, Edward threw himself into restoring the monarchy's prestige. His campaigns in France inaugurated the 100 Years' War. His victories made him a legend in his own lifetime. He established the Order of the Garter, a chivalric fellowship that still exists today. And yet, in private, Edward was not immune to the same human frailties as any man. He mourned the death of his beloved Queen Philippa with inconsolable grief. In later years, he fell under the influence of a much-resented mistress. The vigor of youth gave way to the fatigue of age. As his strength faded, the realm he built began to fracture. So many monarchs shared this fate, acclaimed in youth, diminished in age, ultimately powerless against time. The chronicles record their triumphs in vivid detail: battles won, titles claimed, treaties signed. But they are more reticent about the private moments when a king laid aside his crown. when he sighed in the darkness and wondered whether he had done enough to secure his legacy. The weight of the crown, the burden of lineage, pressed upon every ruler. The expectations of subjects, the envy of rivals, the judgment of posterity. These were the invisible regalia worn as heavily as any jewel-encrusted coronet. And yet, even in the midst of such pressures, there were bright interludes, celebrations of new births, festivals marking a victory, weddings uniting houses that had long been at odds. The great halls would blaze with candlelight, musicians played through the night, the air thick with the scent of wine and spices, with laughter and music. In these moments, perhaps, kings and queens felt closest to the dream of monarchy, the idea that, for a little while, they were more than mortal, that their lives were woven into something grand and unbreakable. But morning always came, and with it, the endless cycle of duties resumed. For in the end, no feast could last forever, no alliance was ever truly secure, and no crown, however splendid, could spare its wearer from the passage of time. In the final reckoning, perhaps what makes these royal stories so enduring is not only the splendor of their ceremonies, nor the wealth amassed in their treasuries, but the quiet, all too human moments that survive in memory. Think of Queen Philippa of Hainault, the steady companion to Edward III. While chroniclers record her many pregnancies, no fewer than 12 children, their lines also pause to praise her charity. She interceded for prisoners condemned to die, founded hospitals for the sick, and was beloved by a people who glimpsed, behind the queenly dignity, a tender heart. Her life, like so many queens before and after, was a cycle of devotion to family, to faith, and to the realm. When Philippa died after yet another childbirth, the entire court mourned. Edward was said to have knelt by her bedside, pressing her hand to his cheek, as if in that final moment he might conjure back the girl he had married so many years before. Such scenes remind us that no palace, however grand, could insulate its rulers from sorrow. For all the privileges of royalty, the feasts, the pageantry, the heraldic banners waving above their battlements, there remained the unchanging truth of mortality. Kings and queens loved, lost, and grew old. They faced betrayals and regrets. They clung to hope, and sometimes surrendered to despair. And yet, despite it all, they built legacies that outlasted them. In the quiet hours after Vespers, a monarch might retire to a chamber lined with illuminated manuscripts. There, by the light of a single candle, they could read the chronicles of those who came before, Charlemagne and Henry II, Eleanor of Aquitaine and St. Louis, seeking in their stories some reassurance that the burdens of the crown could be borne with grace. But even the weightiest crowns could not crush the restless stirrings of the heart. Even the most pious sovereigns wrestled with doubts, and even the most formidable queens like Eleanor or Isabella carried scars the chroniclers only hinted at. For each generation, the cycle repeated. A child born into splendor, taught from the cradle that duty was destiny, that personal longing must yield to the welfare of the realm. Marriages arranged before adolescence, coronations performed beneath vaulted cathedrals echoing with Latin chants, the long train of ceremonies through which a prince became a king, a girl became a queen, and always, the quiet loneliness beneath it all. For to be royal was to dwell behind an invisible wall, watched but never truly known. Even in love, there was calculation. Even in triumph, there was fear of how swiftly fortune might turn. Picture for a moment a winter evening in a medieval castle. The day's business has finally concluded. Courtiers slip away to their quarters, and the corridors fall silent. In the royal bedchamber, a queen sits in her linen nightgown, hair unbound, gazing into the hearth. Perhaps she is remembering her children, some still alive, some lost in infancy. Perhaps she is remembering the girl she once was, before marriage and duty transformed her into an icon. Nearby, a king paces slowly. His crown, heavy with gems, lies upon a carved chest. For once he is simply a man in a woolen robe, pondering treaties, fearing rebellions, and wondering if he will be remembered kindly. In that hush, they are not so different from anyone who has ever lain awake, searching for meaning in the darkness. We may never truly know what these kings and queens dreamed in the hours before sleep. Did Eleanor imagine the sunlit hills of Aquitaine, where she first learned to ride? Did Edward III recall the boy he once was, lifted onto a war horse and told to be brave? Did Philippa in her final days find comfort in the knowledge that her kindness would outlive her? History often reduces them to symbols, portraits in gilded frames, names in genealogies, dates inscribed in chronicles. But the truth is richer. These were people of flesh and blood, no less vulnerable for all their coronets. They loved their children fiercely. They wept in solitude. They yearned for a measure of peace that their stations rarely allowed. And though their jewels have long been locked away in glass cases, though their castles have crumbled to moss-covered ruins, something of their humanity endures. Perhaps that is why, across centuries, we still find ourselves drawn to their stories. Not only to marvel at the extravagance, but to feel the kinship of shared frailty and hope, to sense that in some small way, their lives echo our own. When next you see a faded tapestry depicting a coronation, or walk beneath the vaulted ribs of a cathedral once blessed by royal footsteps, remember this: beneath the regalia, the titles, the elaborate rituals, there beat hearts not so different from yours or mine. For all their power, medieval monarchs were bound by the same longing: to love, to be understood, to leave behind some trace of their passage. And so, as the candles gutter in the draughts of ancient halls, as the last notes of the minstrel's lute fade into the hush, imagine them there, kings and queens slipping into sleep, unburdened at last. May we wish them, across the span of ages, the same blessing we hope for ourselves at the end of a long day. Peace.